Welcome back to the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We're here today with Heather Mason, who is the creator and founder of the Minded Institute in London. I'm very happy to have her on. We're going to be talking about yoga in a bunch of different contexts. But before we even get into those topics, Heather, welcome to the program. And yeah, and if you can introduce yourself and the Minded Institute to the listeners, that would be a great place to start.
Okay, so I might start with the Minded Institute and then track backwards because I have an interesting and somewhat long story. Interrupt me at any time, Jonathan. So the Minded Institute is a yoga therapy training center in London. We train primarily yoga teachers, doctors, healthcare providers, psychologists, etc. Now, I created this really organically as a result of my own experience. From the age of 10 to 23, I suffered from pretty severe mental health issues. And in the interim, actually, before I turned 23, I went to India. I studied there as part of my university education. And I came back to New York to the school that I was studying at. I dropped out, moved to Hawaii, went to the University of Hawaii, and I found myself being much more at peace. But after graduation, moved back to New York and was unable to manage. And so at the age of 23, I went to Southeast Asia and lived there for 3 years, practicing yoga and meditation full-time in ashrams and in Buddhist monasteries. And I actually was going to become a Buddhist nun. But before I did that, I decided that I wanted clarity as to what the Buddhist teachings were. I had this idea that there was just one academic text and I could read it. So I moved to London if I really had the scholastic understanding of what the original tradition had handed down. So I moved to London, and they have a School of Oriental and African Studies, and I did a master's degree in Buddhist studies there, and it changed the course of my life because having lived for 3 years with such intense mind-body practice, I was a transformed person, and life could actually be enjoyable, so I didn't want to go back to the monastery. I moved to Taiwan, and when I lived there, I taught yoga full-time, lectured on Buddhism, and I also was a presenter on the English Learning Channel. And then I came back to London, did a master's in psychotherapy, and I thought, I'll be a psychotherapist. But then somehow it didn't sit with me because the methodology I had used for my own personal healing was not that of talking. So I took sabbatical, trained as a yoga therapist, and came back to the UK. And during my training, I felt there were a lot of claims that the yoga community was making that did not have a real scientific basis. And I was uncomfortable with that because I myself had been so hopeless and helpless. And the last thing I wanted to say was 5 poses to cure this. I just didn't experience that as being part of the reality. So I took up a master's degree in London in neuroscience. And at that time, so it was 2009, I was the only person in the UK that I know of who was really trying to trace the mechanisms behind how yoga evoked neuroplasticity. And so my business went like that, and I couldn't finish the degree, but I did a lot of study. And I developed the Minded Institute because lots of people wanted to train with me. I'm almost at the end of this story, but it's got, I think, some important parts. So I then had an opportunity to move to Boston and to lecture at the Boston University School of Medicine for an elective, which I called Embodied Health, for future doctors about how mindfulness and yoga could be used in their clinical work and the neuroscientific mechanisms that underpin the efficacy. And at the same time, I didn't know this before, but I started to appreciate how stressed out medical students are. I didn't know that, and they really needed this for themselves. And I was still running the Minded Institute, and then finally in 2014, I came back to London again, did another master's in medical physiology, because I felt I wanted to be as close to being a medical doctor as I could in my knowledge base, not in practice, but I was, at that point, I didn't have the time to go to medical school, and the Institute kept growing. I also started making certain connections with people that have what we call in the UK All-Party Parliamentary Groups. and I was giving talks at some what we call APPGs on yoga's value in healthcare, in meeting some of the problems we had. In fact, I was once asked to talk on how a neurological perspective of how yoga could reduce fundamentalism in the youth. I think that was one of the most interesting things I was asked to talk about in an APPG. And then one of the lords helped me to create an APPG, Yoga and Society. And then we decided it would be necessary to have a vehicle that was also available in the world to operate like a company. So I founded something called the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance in, I think, 2016. And I have 5 other directors who are part of that with me. And we work with the National Health Service, hoping to get yoga included into the offerings for people. So it's been a long journey, and there's still more pieces. But I feel like yoga is so transformative, and I want to empower people to take up the practice from the perspective of the evidence-based capacity of what it offers. So that's my background.
Lovely. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, let's dive into, I think probably you mentioned yoga for rewiring the brain. I'd like to start there and then see where it leads. And it's really exciting to talk to another yogi practitioner who's also got this passion for understanding this relationship. And so maybe you could just kick us off with that.
Okay. So I think regardless of what we do, if we practice yoga, it's likely that it's going to give rise to certain neurological changes. And if you want, I'm really happy to describe to your audience, even without a PowerPoint presentation, some of the specific things that yoga offers. So I'm very interested in tracing those for people. And I'm also interested in extrapolating findings from neuroscience and slightly tweaking the way that we practice yoga in order to best stimulate neurological change that we're looking for, right? One of the simplest things, for example, that we could do is we can simply choose to teach a yoga class or to practice yoga where every single time we're engaging in breathing, we elongate the exhalation. And that's so simplistic, but the mechanisms that are then physiologically shifted as a result of that are manifold. So every single time you exhale, and tell me to stop anytime, Jonathan, if I'm if I'm going, off on a tangent.
No, it's perfect.
But, okay,
Please.
You have this thing called your vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve comes out of the medulla oblongata. It's your 10th cranial nerve, and it's also the longest of the cranial nerves. It derives its name from Latin meaning to wander, so it's the wandering nerve. And your vagus connects to, or we say in physiology, articulates to various different points. Now, one of those points is the heart, specifically the sinoatrial node of the heart. And when you inhale, there's a reduction of the vagus sending messages to the heart. When you exhale, however, there's an increased level of the vagus sending messages to the heart. And when it sends those messages, what it does is it slows down the heartbeat and the rate of contraction. And that has a knock-on effect. So you'll have the experience of the lowering of blood pressure on your heart rate. That is then again fed back to your brain, and your brain picks that up. And in that moment, it can calm down. And we can theorize, if you regularly do that continual shift in feedback to the brain actually would lead to changing circuitry towards being more relaxed. So that's an example of how we can use modern science to inform how we practice yoga. And then there's just the interesting pieces of how does yoga not informed by neuroscience potentially change brain functioning.
So when it comes to the activation of the vagus and the feedback of that mechanism, can you speak at all about the dosage before the dosage and the term in which to create that neuroplastic effect?
Well, the truth is that nobody knows, but I can rely on the knowledge of some of my mentors. So Dr. Patricia Gebarg and Richard Brown, who wrote The Healing Power of Breath, and our integrative psychiatrists, have always recommended about 25 minutes a day. And for people with really deeply entrenched mental health issues 25 minutes a day, twice a day. Now, when I have courses actually for people with depression, anxiety, and stress that go over an 8-week period. We meet once a week for 2 hours, and we do an asana practice where this is included for about 110 minutes, like this kind of breathing. And we see people having marked shifts in their reporting. Now, we're not looking at any kind of MRI scan to see what's happening, but that seems to be a measure of a reported change. I wish we knew the answer to that. You know, there's so much research to be done in terms of dosage in yoga.
Yeah. So I would imagine you could measure that with HRV if you're looking at certain metrics and heart rate variability, like high frequency content, or maybe even some of the time domain measures where you can see not just acute, but also longer term. Like if you had people going through your program and they were wearing some mobile HRV equipment for that 8-week period, you could see do some kind of statistical analysis. I'm just wondering, I'm wondering, do you have specific breath rates that you adhere to, or is it simply a matter of having the exhale longer than the inhale?
I mean, it really depends on the person. It's a great question. So I look at how I'm working with somebody from a mental health perspective, from reducing high level of stress and then developing resiliency. And the two are so closely aligned. But if I'm working on resiliency, then the breath rate that most of us know to be the most effective is 5 to 6 breaths a minute, with an inhale of about 6 and an exhale of 6, or an inhale of 5 and an exhale of 5. And that is now being coined the coherent rate. I think that Stephen Elliott coined that term in the US. So for that purpose, it's probably the most beneficial. And it's actually really interesting as to why as well. But if you're trying just to downgrade your stress in a moment and it's very high level, I believe that it would be faster to use the vagal brake on the heart through the elongated exhalation. So it's, what do you need now? Because heart rate variability is that flexibility within the autonomic nervous system, which finds parity with cognitive flexibility. So the ability to shift your thought processes.
Yeah. Well, what's neat about this conversation is that you're using a definable system and metric like vagal tone to as a way to essentially create state change. And you're looking at the psychological state change as a result of the physiological change.
Yeah, which I think is important if we're going to apply yoga therapeutically. You know, if the purpose of our practice is that kind of spiritual unfolding, which it is for many of us, then it's different. But if you're trying to work towards improving your mental health or teaching somebody else to do the same, I think you do need a metric.
When it comes to effects in the brain itself, what can you say about that?
Okay, so let's see. I think, and let's come back to the vagus, and we'll move from there. So in 2012, doctors Chris Streeter and Patricia Gebhardt, that's actually the woman who I mentioned, Dr. Patricia Gebhardt, before, put together a paper in Medical Hypotheses about how potentially change was being evoked in the brain as a result of the vagus. So let's start with that because we've already talked about it. So interestingly, we know now that 80% of the fibers of the vagus move from the body to the brain, or we call that afferent. And so there's a huge capacity to influence brain function through the messaging that we send. And both have hypothesized that slow controlled breathing, for example, may have that effect because the vagus lines the respiratory tract. So then what happens? Well, to just take another piece, in 2007, Chris Streeter, the first author on this paper, found that the practice of yoga was associated with increased levels of GABA. GABA is a neurotransmitter, and its main function is inhibition. And for our intents and purposes, it inhibits fear-based pathways. And in 2010, after a critical review of her paper where people said maybe any movement did that, she then demonstrated that actually yoga was more effective than an exercise-matched control in increasing GABA levels to a statistically significant level, suggesting that really yoga has something very unique. So based upon that, they then put together this very interesting theory. What they hypothesized was that somehow through that vagal input to the brain, through the slow controlled breathing and possibly through holding postures or other manners, that the vagus would cause this huge release in GABA. Now in the moment, one of the things that would do is inhibit fear-based pathways. GABA specifically, for example, inhibits certain receptor sites in the amygdala, the alarm bell of the brain. So we would be able to calm down. But what I find even more interesting is what potentially they hypothesized can happen if you release that GABA at higher levels regularly. So we know for sure, and they were not the people to determine this, that whenever you flood the brain with a neurotransmitter, you shift the circuitry. I mean, that is one of the reasons that the first time, if you were to take cocaine, you want it again, not just because it felt so good, but your brain networks actually can shift like that. So with high level GABA release, we have the same capacity. And in this paper, they suggested two things that I find really interesting. One was that potentially GABA could actually shift the wiring of the prefrontal cortex. So should I describe what that is, or should I take for granted that? Okay, all right. So the prefrontal cortex is like here, prefrontal, okay? And it is colloquially known as the structure for executive functioning. So if you think of what it means to be an executive, that's essentially what it means to be your prefrontal cortex. You have to take in various different inputs, and you have to make the best decision. You have to try and be innovative in the way that you think. You have to plan ahead. You have to also downgrade fear and agitation and mutiny, but listen when fear is really, really high and kind of turn off for just a moment and hear what the rest of the people or the rest of the brain has to say. Now, across the board in almost all mental health issues, we have both a reduction in volume and activity within the prefrontal cortex. So what they suggested, which was really interesting, was that the GABA would actually help to rewire the prefrontal cortex. Now, you would think, well, why would I want an inhibitory neurotransmitter in a structure that I need to be really active? That seems counterintuitive. But what happens is, if you turn off certain pathways, you actually invite the possibility for growth of other ones, right? So by inhibiting, you allow change. The other structure that they talked about that potentially would be really marked in terms of people's lived experience was a shift over time in the insula, also known as the insular cortex. So slightly deeper, somewhat frontal, like around here, is your insular cortex on the left and right side. The insula is a more complex structure to understand. It's often expressed as a structure that is associated with our feeling perception of ourselves. And I think that's very vague. So let me give you a better example. It's easiest if I describe this from the mental health condition of anorexia. So for somebody who is anorexic at an acute level, they genuinely, hand on heart, will actually perceive themselves as being large, even though they are critically skinny. So in people with anorexia, research actually shows that their insular cortex has aberrant activity, so that their bodily perception is confused. We also find that in chronic pain. We also find that in PTSD. And what they believe happens is that as GABA also floods the insular cortex, there is a rewiring of networks there as well. And somehow, and we're not sure how this, it's almost like magically happens, but not magical. there is a greater congruence that will start to arrive between somebody's felt body sense and what I guess we would all objectively agree that body is. I don't want to use appears like. So for example, somebody who's anorexic might say, oh God, I am really, really critically thin and this is a problem. And so that's the first part of the potential rewiring. And this ability of the GABA to shift different circuits is not limited to the amygdala, the insular cortex, and the prefrontal cortex, but their paper is incredibly complex, and I think those are enough areas. There's another really exciting piece that I like to talk about, which is the relationship between our cerebellum and our prefrontal cortex, which wouldn't be unique to yoga, but we would find in yoga, dance, and martial arts. So when I grew up, and I don't know, Jonathan, about you, we learned that the cerebellum was responsible for balance. Was it the same when you went to school? Yeah. Well, Duke University, since I think around 2008, has spent quite a lot of time investigating the cerebellum. And we've known since then, with an increasing body of research, that actually the cerebellum plays a core role in emotional balance. So it's like a structure that can hold metaphor. Now, I was really interested in speaking to some people in the trauma world who were talking about yoga's value in potentially increasing prefrontal cortical function. How is it doing that? And this was before I knew about the GABA paper that I mentioned. And this researcher who I spoke to at a conference, Adele Diamond, said, I've been doing work demonstrating that when you plan new movements, your cerebellum actually talks to your prefrontal cortex because it's not an automated movement yet. And in that process, not only do you enhance the pathway, but actually you allow the development of the prefrontal cortex. And so any style of yoga where you are involved in starting, stopping, starting and stopping, so it's all of our flow forms, you would be using this pathway. And it's important that in doing that, you would be engaging in something that wasn't automated for you. So you would need to do something different. So as a yoga teacher, and I didn't mention that part of my bio actually, I'm a yoga teacher and yoga therapist. I just realized that. So as a yoga teacher, if I'm trying to activate that network, I try to do things that are going to make people feel a little bit clumsy. And sometimes myself, I go to Zumba class because that's the clumsiest I feel. I'm bumping into everybody. Do you want me to keep going?
That's fascinating. Well, no, a whole bunch of questions are emerging. And so if we can talk about back to vagal stimulation and longer exhales, do you think that it matters whether or not someone is moving, or let me rephrase that. Do you think that doing that while moving or while sitting, like more of like a meditation type of context, would have any more or less effect on creating that GABA release?
That's such a good question. Nobody ever asked me that before, so I have to think about it.
In other words, if you were breathing at the same rate, doing a yoga class versus breathing at the same rate, sitting it quietly as you were meditating, has anyone done like pre-post GABA testing on that, or vagal tone testing on that, or even short, mid, long-term testing on that?
Well, vagal tone is, first of all, vagal tone is a derived measure, so it's very hard to actually measure it directly. It's just derived from heart rate variability. I think that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has looked specifically at the effect of breathing on GABA without also the inclusion of yoga. Pat Gebarg, and again, Chris Streeter, it came out today, in fact, so I know that this is not good. People won't have it today, but March 23rd, 2020, actually their research of combining coherent breathing and Iyengar yoga together and the effect on GABA levels was published today. So, but I don't think that anybody has looked just at breathing. Coming back to your question though, which I think is really interesting, which one would be more likely to release GABA at a higher level? I think it depends, because there's something about being still and entering that deep parasympathetic state that I imagine would actually be more powerful in helping to increase the release of this neurotransmitter associated with relaxation than moving and breathing. However, in terms of neuroplasticity, I would hypothesize that the moving with the breathing would be more powerful, because you're also going to be releasing, especially if you're doing like more active yoga that is for you personally challenging, and you're breathing, you're going to be releasing the other major neurotransmitter in the brain, glutamate. And glutamate's ability to shift neuronal circuits and enhance plasticity is great. And so I imagine that when you have both of those networks, like the GABA and the glutamate, kind of really active at the same time, it would be grander than one alone. And until you asked me that question, I never thought about it. So thank you.
Getting back to your comment about the cerebellum and emotional balance as well as physical balance, does that mean that if you were practicing novel movement in a way that you were challenging balance and you had to sort through it in real time rather than be on automation, that you can enhance emotional balance, and that there's some way to perhaps measure that? And if you were to practice some type of emotional regulation, I'm riffing right now, but if you were to practice some kind of emotional regulation technique regularly, that you may notice an improved ability to physically balance, or an improved ability to learn faster in some skill when you were moving.
I think so. Nobody has done that research to my knowledge, but I think so. And I think so enough that I actually talk about exactly that point in my training. There was a paper published in Nature in 2018 by the same group at Duke University. And in that paper, they talk about the fact that one of the core features that they're finding, or the neurological signature for people with mental health issues, is this issue around cerebellic volume, and that people have issues with coordination. So those two are going together. And I believe that when you develop coordination and you develop balance, that it is going to have an impact on those frontal networks, and vice versa, just like you said. And there is one study, not about the cerebellum, but about another structure involved in motor circuitry, the basal ganglia, that I think is suggestive of that overlap and how it can happen. I can speak to that study because it's really cool.
Yeah, please.
Right now it's a different question.
No,
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So in 2015, Dr. Tim Gard at Harvard, he looked at the different level of connectivity in yogi brains and also mindfulness meditators, but I'm just going to focus on the yoga practitioners here, even though there's overlap, and those who do not. Now, I think that a lot of us in the know would have imagined that the greatest connectivity would have been between like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and suddenly, the prefrontal cortex has a much greater capacity to downgrade that fear circuitry. But actually what they found is that there was greater connectivity between the basal ganglia and other motor circuits, and the basal ganglia and frontal circuits. So I have a lot of describing and explaining to do so that this makes sense. So the basal ganglia is kind of somewhere between the midbrain and the forebrain, and it's a bunch of different nuclei that allow us to start and stop and start and stop so that we can engage in gingerly movements. So like if I'm eating a salad and I want to pick up my lettuce leaf with my fork, initiation, inhibition, and then I move it, initiation, inhibition, and so on and so forth. And the structure specifically that Tim Gard found in the basal ganglia that was most connected was the caudate. So basically, what he discovered in his study was that for people who practiced yoga, the caudate was strongly connected to other motor circuits and strongly connected to prefrontal cortical circuits. And so what does that mean for us? Well, he didn't really describe it so much in his paper, so somebody else picked it up and said, this is what I think it means. That by engaging in yoga, where we start and stop and start and stop, again, a flowing kind of yoga specifically, but it doesn't have to be. I guess you're doing that whenever you move into a pose and out of it. You are highlighting the ability of your body to do that. So it makes perfect sense that the basal ganglia and other motor circuits would be more wired. But again, you have to plan to do that. And because you have to plan to do that, your basal ganglia, your caudate to be more specific, needs to crosstalk with your prefrontal cortex all the time. And in that process, you have much greater connectivity. Now here's the exciting takeaway from that. It seems that when the caudate and the prefrontal cortex have greater connectivity, it affords us the ability to initiate and inhibit thought. So we move from a place of thinking, I don't want to think that, and not being able to redirect the mind and have that attentional control, to suddenly being able to say, this is useful thinking for me. This is not useful thinking for me. And having that capacity through moving and starting and stopping practice, rather than having to really, really push to get the mind to do what we want it to do in the moment. So coming back to your point, Jonathan, theoretically, because of how this operates in both ways, that through movement, we affect how we function cognitively, theoretically, through balance, we should be able to also affect the cerebellum's relationship to mental health and well-being.
I want to ask you a lot of questions too about the way that a person is moving, because as you well know, inside yoga asana traditions, there are a variety of ways to move. You can move relatively quickly, which generally happens at the yoga studio and like a flow class. You can increase or decrease the load at which the structure has to work in order to do those movements. You can hold poses for a long time, like you referenced Iyengar, generally speaking, compared to like a flow class. And so where do you land in this whole spectrum, since you are informed? It sounds like mostly your practice that you're teaching is informed by the science. Where do you land with all of this?
I think that they all have benefits, but different ones. So with gaining that connectivity with the caudate, I imagine that a flow class would be great with the starting and stopping and the starting and stopping. But I also think it's really important that people are becoming really mindful of that action, because also then the prefrontal cortex is going to be speaking to the basal ganglia in order to do that. Interestingly, I think that Kirtan Kriya, this one, Sata Nama, this is probably actually one of the best ways, because the fingers have fine motor control well beyond moving the whole body. I mean, somebody could argue that we're using many more motor circuits when we're moving the whole body and we're going through like a vinyasa flow, and they'd be right. But the fingers have more real estate on the motor cortex than other parts of the body, and controlling them, although we're so used to it, takes quite a lot of brain activity. In terms of the holding of poses, I think that there are other definitive neurological benefits, and that definitely there is a plasticity to be had there, but presumably through different mechanisms. I'm trying to recall, because I actually teach about this. What is the different mechanism? I remember now. I could talk to that if you want, about what I think long holds do as opposed to the flow. Okay, so I love talking about this stuff. So
Good.
So when you hold a posture, what happens is there are all of these sensory bodies on the muscles and also on the tendons that fire back up to the spinal cord and to the brain. Now, when you hold a posture for a longer period of time, you have tension mounting within a tendon, right? Because what happens is a muscle will start to stretch towards the belly like this way, right? Like if it were your calf, kind of this way. And then there is going to be more strain at its insertion points at the tendon. And the tendon will pick that up. And as we're there longer and longer, it will fire more and more and more and more to the brain. It's kind of like, I'm here a long time. Can you hear me? Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. The impact of that is that there is such a great amount of feedback being sent to the brain. And so the neurological change that can occur as a result of that is presumably a clearer understanding of the body by the brain. So for those people, for example, that would have this lack of congruence of their physical body state, this will allow those neuroplastic changes, I believe. There are other things as well. I'm trying to think of what would be the easiest to describe. Just give me a second, Jonathan, in terms of like the long hauls. I'm sorry. I'm really doing all of this just off the cuff. There's also potentially the impact on oxygen saturation and how that would affect the brain in a long hold. So, and the effect of holding a pose and then coming out of it. So whenever we hold a pose like this, what we're doing is we're slightly occluding blood flow, right? From going into the arm, especially for like this or for in a warrior position. So kind of like a tourniquet, we are wrapping some tension around blood vessels. And so we have this increased amount of blood volume in certain areas where it's not being pumped to. And once we come out of that position, what happens, not as extreme as if we had a tourniquet and we're getting, you know, like some kind of blood taken from our veins or something like that, but the blood will rush through the vessels. And we know that when that happens, that there are little receptor sites on the endothelial wall that lines the blood vessels that pick up that increased rate. And what happens is then they release nitric oxide. And nitric oxide dilates our blood vessels, right? So then you have this change in blood flow at a global level. And that again is going to be fed back to your brain as a state of calm and relaxation. I don't know what kind of neuroplasticity would exist over the long term, but I'm sure that it would lead to some kind of change. Relatedly, when we engage in very relaxed states for long periods of time, that is also going to help to support a shift in brainwave state that will probably lead to neuroplasticity. So like our yoga nidra, and then completely on the other end of the spectrum. And this is because I'm speaking about so many different things and I don't want to confuse people. When we engage in very dynamic forms of yoga, we would also be enhancing neuroplasticity through a different mechanism, or through a mechanism that is related to everything, but most strongly highlighted when we're very physically active. So we have this protein complex called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And BDNF, we call it colloquially the fertilizer of the brain. And it is necessary to generate new neurons. So neuroplasticity is not just new rewiring. You can actually, your brain itself can generate new neurons at every stage of your life, which is amazing because we didn't always know that to be the case. And you need BDNF for that generation. At the same time, BDNF helps one neuron to connect to another neuron, and it does that through what we call dendrites. So when we engage in anything that is strongly dynamic, it doesn't have to be yoga. We know through a lot of research and exercise, and some in yoga, that we increase levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so your rigorous forms of yoga are going to be able to do that. Oh, there's one more I want to mention, but is it too much?
No, no.
Okay, okay. The last one about the potential of long holds. It's not limited to long holds. You can have this in a vinyasa flow class, but a long hold is going to give you more time to really check in with your body. So Catherine Kerr, she's a researcher at Brown University, found something amazing in 2013. I think it's amazing, at least. She found, through looking at meditators that focused on body sensations, so Goenka meditators, if any of you know what Goenka meditation is, she found that the structure that sends the messages about sensations to the processing regions actually enhanced the amount of information it was sending when we purposely paid attention to sensations in the body. And that structure is the thalamus. So when you are focusing your mind on purpose, on parts of your body or sensations in your body, your thalamus increases the volume of activity to other structures. And so suddenly you literally move out of rumination and you feel more. It's not just that you're more aware, you feel more, you hear more, you see more. It's quite amazing, all but smell, because smell does not course through the thalamus. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, she found that when people ruminate, that actually the thalamus dampens its amount of information. So you literally are feeling, hearing, seeing less when you ruminate. Now, what's magical for me about yoga is that you do not have to purposely focus on body sensations and have that attentional control. If you're in bow, if you're in a warrior, if you're in anything that is physically difficult for you, regardless of what your capacity or level is, you can help but notice what you are feeling. And by doing that, you are increasing the generation of those signals. And again, whenever you do something like that, you afford some kind of plastic change. Okay, so that's all I got, I think.
Yeah, I love everything that you're saying. And it makes me think that I would imagine that with that sensory increase and the increased activation of the thalamus, that there would also be an increased activation in the insula as well, since there is a lot of research showing that body awareness and insular activity are connected. On that note, and I want to just throw this out there around meditation research, is the insula is implicated quite a bit in loving kindness meditation, in increased gamma activity. And I wonder if you are aware of this research, and if you have, so it's pretty fascinating. So I do some neurofeedback work with clients, and that's one of the areas that we look at is we basically ask that part of the brain to increase its gamma, and with that increased gamma, when you're cultivating some type of positive emotion, whatever that may be. It could be a low arousal emotion like peace, or a high arousal emotion like joy, that will see increased gamma. But the feeling state of you start to feel your body more as you feel the emotion more.
That makes perfect sense, and such interesting research.
Yeah. So Richie Davidson, and he talks a lot more about the gamma as well, and the gamma and the insula. I want to segue. This might be a good point, because he has in one of his books, I have it here somewhere. I can send it to you later if you're interested. But one of the things that he talks about is there are people that have almost a dysfunctional level of activation in the insula, where they're overly aware of their body to the point of perhaps it being self-destructive. Maybe they are kind of having, we'll say, hypochondriac type of sensitivities, like they're always concerned something is wrong with them. And so you're shaking your head like, yeah, that might be something you're aware of. Can you speak to that?
So first of all, I know that Richie Davidson has looked at overactivity in the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And you can have aberrant activity there, and more isn't always better. Even though when we're speaking, just generally in sweeping statements, we generally would say that it is, but you're definitely accurate. Now, my experience is that people that have heightened awareness of sensations and thereby feel that they actually need to downgrade that have placed over actual real content an imagined sense of sensation. I've worked with people like this a lot, so this is coming from my clinical experience. And when you calm somebody down that has that, and there is more parasympathetic drive in their nervous system, that actually these overwhelming sensations cease to be present, and actually they say they are feeling their body for the first time. Now, I can't speak to whether or not that is due primarily to increased circuitry in the insular cortex, but we do know that the insula has an ability via sending messaging back down to the thalamus to impact our perception of sensation. And so I imagine that would be what's happening. And as you help people to clarify what's actually occurring, that shifts. Now, it's just about doing it intelligently, because if you say to somebody, actually, you're not really feeling those sensations, just be aware of what you really feel, that's not going to be a useful strategy. But if you slowly help somebody to reduce their fear and those associations, and then gently over time introduce them to dipping into bare bones body sensation and noticing the difference between what they perceive as happening and what they actually really feel, they can decouple that and start to experience their body as a place of safety and not be overwhelmed by those sensations, because it's more cognitions, even though those two are so close.
Can you speak a bit about anxiety and yoga for anxiety? I know we have covered some probably relevant areas so far, but more specifically, could you discuss that?
Okay, that's a very broad topic. I I actually wrote a chapter on that in my book, Yoga for Mental Health. What would you like to know, Jonathan, about that?
Well, okay, so let's make it contextual to now. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are experiencing anxiety right now with our situation. And so perhaps some relevant strategies or how to make yoga relevant to this situation that can help them.
I mean, it's a lot of what I've just said. Do your yoga practice or asana practice with elongation of exhalation. It's actually not the fancy stuff that works. It's the really simple things. And it's mostly, in my experience, to do with modifying how you're breathing with your practice rather than the exactly how you're moving. Another thing that you can do, aside from the elongation of the exhalation, is you can purposely pose by pose by pose, notice where you feel the breath and bring the breath down. So something that we all do when we're anxious is we engage in rapid chesty breathing, or we would say in physiology, accessory breathing, because it activates all of the accessory muscles. Whereas when we're relaxed, we engage in diaphragmatic breathing, breathing lower down into the lungs. And actually, because you have so many amazing sensory fibers in the lungs, when you breathe into the chest, you are indicating to your brain that you are in a state of fear. And when you breathe lower down into the lungs, you're indicating to your brain that you are calm. So if in every single posture you notice where you're breathing, and then you actively bring the breath down into the lower lungs over and over again, this will definitely help to downgrade the experience. And this is interesting in yoga because for some of us that practice more classical forms, we tighten at the solar plexus, which we call Uddiyana Bandha. Now, there's nothing wrong with that practice. And Uddiyana Bandha, even if I trace it physiologically and not spiritually, has real value. But if our goal is to downgrade anxiety, we have to let go of that holding we so often talk about in yoga as teachers, where we're trying to bring the navel to the spine, and instead either practice ourselves or cue our students to bring the breath down over and over. Now, when I really want to help people, I teach them both of those skills separately and then I bring them together, where you inhale into the lower lungs, exhale out of the lower lungs longer than you inhaled. And I mean, aside from that, you can do things with grounding. It would probably take too long for me to teach that here now. I'm happy to do another segment if you ever want me to on grounding. But if you just did those two things in your asana practice, I'm pretty sure after years and years of working with people, you would start to feel a reduction in the anxious states you feel. And then the other piece is just adding the mindfulness component, which we hope naturally would come into our yoga practice, but sometimes it doesn't, which is noticing each and every time that the mind moves away from the breath, becoming more and more conscious of that, and then bringing the mind back to these breathing techniques that I'm talking about. It's gone off. I'm thinking about, am I going to get sick? I'm thinking about, how will I make money in the future? Or if it's not about the present crisis, I'm thinking about whatever worries me. And I'm duly sure that if I keep worrying about it, I'll come up with a solution. No, probably not the case. Probably if the mind is lucid and clear and one-pointed. So you just notice and you bring it back to elongating the exhalation with bringing the breath down. And you notice and you bring it back. And you notice and you bring it back. And as you get better at that process of bringing the mind back, while at the same time regulating your breathing, you have a very powerful way, naturally, of being able to downgrade anxiety. And you're talking to somebody who had post-traumatic stress, social anxiety, just generalized anxiety. And I can tell you that this works from my own lived experience.
Heather, please let the listeners know how they can learn more about your organization.
So you can go to my website, www.themindedinstitute.com. And also, if you want more insight into how yoga affects brain functioning, you can purchase my book if you'd like, Yoga and Mental Health. I didn't write it alone. I wrote it with leaders in yoga for mental health conditions and neuroscience. And each chapter is co-authored by a yoga therapist and a psychiatrist or psychologist on different mental health conditions, providing advice and the reasons that particular things work.